At year-end, we're all conscious of passing time. We wish we had more, but the sand keeps running through the hourglass. At crucial times, great leaders arise, often from common roots. They find themselves at the vortexes of history and are called upon to make momentous choices. Today, we learn about one such leader, a woman named Esther. Stay with us. From Chicago's Moody Church, this is Running to Win with Dr. Erwin Lutzer, whose clear teaching helps us make it across the finish line. Today, Erwin Lutzer invites all of us to take a moment for reflection, to consider our place for such a time as this.
But now this morning I want to tell you a story. It is a biblical story. It is a true story. It's a true story of love and courage, a story that involves a little orphan who grew up to be a beautiful woman. The story takes place 2,500 years ago in Susa, the palace in Persia. Here's what happened. There was a king who was reigning at that time whose name was Artaxerxes, actually Xerxes the First, Ahasuerus, as he is called in the Bible. And one day he decided to throw a feast, and because he did things in a grand way, he had a feast that lasted for 6 months. Because he was the ruler of 127 provinces, he invited all of the leaders of the provinces to come together, the heads of his army, and they began to drink and they reveled, and this went on month after month, 180 days to be exact. After that period of time, Ahasuerus said to himself, I'd like to throw a feast now for all those who are here in the palace. And that feast went on for 7 days. And pretty soon everybody was drunk. The Bible says that wine flowed freely and everyone was in a drunken stupor. And in that context, the king said, I want my wife, whose name is Vashti, to come, and I want her to parade in front of us. Vashti, who was a modest woman, said what every good woman should say. She said no. Reminds me of the Sunday school boy who came home from class and his parents said to him, what did you learn in Sunday school? And he said, we studied creation. What did you learn? The boy said, we learned that God took Adam and put him to sleep and then took out his brain and made a woman. So Vashti said no, and the king, even though he was drunk, it didn't mean that he was stupid. He called a council and he called his advisors together and said, what shall we do? And the advisors came up with 3 ideas. Number 1, they said, Vashti needs to be deposed. Secondly, they said, we fear that news is going to leak across the 127 provinces that she has disobeyed her husband, and therefore let us make a decree that all women must obey their husbands, and let us publish it in all the languages of the realm, and let us use horses to get it to everybody that needs to know it. Women, obey your husbands. That was number 2. Number 3, they said, what you really need is a replacement. The king loved all 3 ideas, and so he decided to hold a beauty contest. In order to hold a beauty contest, he said that he wanted to take the most beautiful virgins from all the 127 provinces. He asked each of them to make sure that they had their own pageant in the country in which they lived, and then the final contestants were to be brought there to the palace. And then he phoned Regis and Kathy Lee and said, would you please host it for me? If you're a new Christian, I should point out that that part of the story is actually in some of the most recent manuscripts only. And so we had this big beauty contest to find who the next Miss Persia would be. And Miss Persia turned out to be a woman whose name is Esther, whose cousin Mordecai took care of her because she was an orphan. And she was a beautiful woman. She was brought into the palace along with all the other women, and it took them 1 year before they could see the king, because there were 2 periods of purification that involved cosmetics and oils and creams and all kinds of various perfumes, and the girls had to be schooled in the ways in which the king lived. And so they paraded in front of him, and he chose Esther, and he threw a feast, and he crowned her as his new wife. At that point, the Bible takes us into another part of the story and introduces us to a man whose name is Haman. Haman, the Bible says, is an Agagite. Now, if you live in the north, you don't know anything about the Aggies because they are primarily in the south. And if you're from the south, you should know that this Aggie was a different kind. As far as we know, he was a descendant of a king who was supposed to have been killed by Saul. You remember in the Old Testament, God said, Saul, I want you to kill the king of Agag. And Saul said no. And as a result of that, there was a whole descendant of people who hated the Jews. And Haman hated the Jews. And he was promoted by Xerxes to the point of being the chief man in the realm, next to the king himself. And there was one thing that Haman could not stand, and that is that Mordecai, who was there in the palace as a porter, refused to bow down to him when Haman walked into the palace of the king. And every day Haman would walk by, and Mordecai would not bow down. And Haman was not amused. So he said to the king one day, he said, I've got lots of money. I'll give you all of this money. We'll put it into your treasure. All that I'm asking you to do is to kill all the Jews in the land. You have to understand that there are people here with different customs and different ways, and what we need to do is to get rid of them, and let us publish it, a decree of the Medes and the Persians, spread it throughout the empire, and let us make sure that all the people know that on a certain day all Jews are dead. The king signed the decree. It went to 127 provinces. Esther didn't know about it, but Mordecai, her cousin, who reared her, was sitting outside the palace in sackcloth and ashes mourning. She looked out of the palace window and she said, what could be wrong with my friend Mordecai who reared me? And she sent a messenger and said, what's wrong? And she sent him some clothes because he was mourning in sackcloth and ashes, and Mordecai did not accept them. So then she began to communicate, and she discovered that the king had made this decree. And the Bible says that Mordecai then gave her a copy of the decree and said, Esther, guess what? You have to go into the king and you have to intercede on our behalf. Esther said, no way. There are several reasons why I can't do it. Number one, I have never revealed to him that I am a Jewess. And I don't know what will happen when he finds that out. Secondly, she says, I cannot do it because his love for me has cooled. He has not seen me in 30 days. And thirdly, she said, everybody who goes to see the king, unless they are invited, automatically is beheaded. So I'm not going. Mordecai, bless his heart, gave her a lesson.